The Passover was not something that was centered purely on the rabbi and the synagogue. It wasn't something that could only be done at a temple. The Passover has a lot of resilience against the corruptions of the ages because it's a family-centered one. And each family gathers around the table, opens the scriptures for themselves, and looks at the writings of Moses and celebrates going through the steps of Moses's journey. And because Moses is a type of Christ, and because the Passover Lamb is a type of Christ, and because the bread of the Passover is a type of Christ, and most of all, because Christ himself at the Last Supper declared and taught and prepared his disciples and followers and those that loved him for his eventual crucifixion and sacrifice at the Passover. This teaching table can be a profound way to help bring us to Christ. And it can also help us to understand some of the symbols that he teaches us through and how he works and prepare for a future Passover. So I want to get into talking a little bit about the Passover, if you'll give me a minute to share my screen. Let me just click on this. Come on. Can everybody see this? There we go.
Looks good.
Okay. I entitled this, Each of Us a Slave in Egypt, because Egypt, though a physical place, is also a symbolic place, a place of bondage. And the journey out of Egypt is a symbolic journey from bondage to freedom. And that's one of the reasons why the Passover feast is sometimes called a teaching table and a journey to freedom. So I want to begin talking about the Passover by talking about a modern Passover story, how the Passover affects us and affects people even now and today. Even though this happened so long ago, it still has resonances and connections to people living today. The Passover is centered in Egypt. I have a picture of Egypt here. As you can see, it's a little bit of oasis in the desert and along the Nile. The Nile is very, very long. And during ancient times, the people did not know where the Nile began. The Egyptians could get up as far as the fifth cataract, but they couldn't really go much further into the mountains. The Greeks sent expeditions to look for the headwaters of the Nile. The Romans sent an expedition of the headwaters of the Nile. They got entrapped in the wetlands of Sud. There were so many crocodiles and hippos and malaria that the Egyptians had to turn back. The headwaters of the Nile wasn't really discovered until the 1800s. Part of it is Lake Victoria, and Queen Victoria was the Queen of England. So that's how long it took people to get to the headwaters of the Nile. And the reason why I'm giving this whole long spiel about how isolated the headwaters of the Nile is because I want to talk about the people that live there in the land of Gondar. Not Gondor, that's Lord of the Rings, Gondar. And in these isolated mountains, there are a people that have been disconnected from the rest of the world for millennia. These people are called Beta Israel because they are Jews. How could these isolated people be Jews? Well, they have legends and stories that they were people that were refugees during the time of Nebuchadnezzar when he destroyed the first temple, and how they were a people that separated and ran away from that destruction, and they ended up in the mountains far away from anyone else. And they said they were Jewish, but they spoke a Hebrew that had changed through the years, and some of their traditions had changed. But when Israel was established in 1948, they claimed the right of return. They wanted to go back to their homeland, where a millennia ago they had been driven away by the forces of Assyria. They wanted to claim the law of return. Now, this caused a lot of debate in Israel. For one thing, the people of Beta Israel, they didn't look like Jews. They had dark skin, and their religion was slightly different than the religion of the other Jews. They were a persecuted people. They lived in the mountains where they were surrounded by some Christians on one side and Islam on the other, and both of those religions practiced conversion by the sword. And so many of them had given up their lives to keep their faith and their religion in a hostile people in a hostile area. Were they of Israel? Well, this question was hotly debated in Israel, whether these people with dark skin, so isolated, could be part of the descendants of Abraham. And the question got to be a question of life and death when a dictator took control of Egypt. He was a horrible man. He practiced lots of genocide. He instituted a communist government in Egypt. And the persecution that these people were used to changed because they wanted to return to Israel. Many people in Israel were touched because its connection to the Passover story. The people bondage in Egypt wanted to come to the land of their forefathers. They wanted to come to the Promised Land. They wanted to come to Israel. And so this dictator, he bartered with their lives. He would let them go in exchange for weapons that he would use to rain with blood and terror upon the rest of the Ethiopians. So there were some people that worked to bring some of the Beta Israel to Israel. They had two migrations. One was called Operation Moses, and the other was called Operation Solomon. They were granted the right of return, that's symbolized with a key, to return to the homeland of Israel. And even though they were separated from Israel millennia ago, there was no records, they had a dark skin color, they had legends that, who knows where they came from. And the language analysis was inconclusive. And there was just some concern about who these people are that were begging for the right of return. The question is he my brother? Would they let these people of Egypt come to Israel? Well, many of the people of Israel decided to fight to bring these people out of Egypt, out of the bondage of their dictator and out of Israel. And luckily for them, that dictator started to lose power. The Soviet Union started to fall and they were supporting Egypt. And the dictator started to lose power. There were rebel forces. Most of them were from Thracia, so they're called the Thracian rebels. And as they fought against the forces of Miriam, and he weakened, the people of Israel saw a way to bring home the scattered Israel, to bring them metaphorically through the Red Sea and back to the Promised Land, back to Israel. Operations Moses and Joshua, they had, traded weapons for the people's lives. And the rebel forces that were trying to overthrow the dictator knew that. And so they felt that the people of Beta Israel were valuable as hostages, so they could arm themselves. And so they were coming to capture the people of Beta Israel and to use them as bartering chips to try and gain weapons. So Israel in 1991 launched Operation Solomon to free these people in bondage in Egypt. The people of Beta Israel had to walk or take buses 260 miles to get to the capital of Egypt, which was Addis Ababa. And many of them died along the way. They left just about everything they had. They came with just the clothes on their backs, the 260 miles. And then they waited. They waited for the promised help to deliver them out of bondage. And as they were waiting, the rebels, the Thracian rebels, started marching towards the airport to capture them and hold them hostage. And this happened to be on a Friday, a Sabbath day. That means in Israel, the law behind Jews would not be using any planes or trains or any forms of transportation because it's the Sabbath. But the laws of Judaism, the law of Moses, says that if you need to save a life on the Sabbath day, you're commanded to do it. And so all the grounded planes that wouldn't be flying on the Sabbath, 130 of them, were commandeered to fly to Ethiopia and save Beta Israel. They lined up 35 nonstop flights and they loaded them with people. The people were very anxious to get on and get out of Egypt. And as they climbed on and flight after flight after flight left, the forces of the rebels were coming closer and closer to capture them and keep them in bondage. The last plane was a 747, which is a large airplane. It has a capacity of 366, but they knew that when that plane took off, that the rest of the rebels, anyone left behind, would be captured. So the Ethiopians took every chair and everything they could out of the airplane, threw it out on the tarmac, and they stuffed everyone inside of the 747. So this plane with a capacity of 366, they fit 1,088 passengers into it. And it's a 6-hour flight to Israel. Can you imagine that crowding? But they were unwilling to leave anyone behind. They just squished together and got everyone on that plane. On the plane, on the flight over, 2 of the women went into labor and had babies on the flight. If you can imagine a more crowded and uncomfortable position to give birth. But these babies were born on the way to freedom. And you can't stop labor once it starts. So these children were born in the airplane, midwifed by the other over 1,000 passengers that they were rubbing elbows with. And they flew to the land of Israel and landed, and they were granted asylum and the right of return, the key. This picture of this man kissing the earth, there's a lot of pictures of people kissing the earth once they got to Israel, once they were out of bondage, once they were led out of Egypt, and they were in the land of their forefathers. They were back in Israel. They were set up in refugee camps. They were given food and water and taken care of. And they were able to worship God according to the dictates of their own conscience, unpersecuted. And, well, at the time they were rescued, there were not widely available DNA tests. But not too long after, they became available, and people were very anxious to see who these people of Beta Israel really were. Were they the blood of Israel? So they widely tested their DNA and found out that yes, they are the blood of Israel. Even though they look different than they thought Israel would look, and they talk different than they thought Israel would talk, it is written in their blood and in their DNA. They are of Israel. And some of them have a much closer relationship than many of the other Jews from Europe or from Russia that had also migrated to Israel. They kept their bloodlines pure throughout over 1,000 years. So I'm telling the story of this modern group of people who in 1991 came out of Israel to introduce the power of the Passover. This story of bondage to freedom plays out over and over again. There's more than one type of bondage, and it's a part of the human heart to yearn and to long to be free. And that part of the human heart is honored in the Passover. If there's anything the Passover teaches us, is that God has an answer for our longing to be free, that He is there to bring us out of bondage, out of Egypt. I told the story of literally coming out of Egypt, but for most of us, coming out of Egypt is symbolic. The central and most powerful symbol of the Passover is the Passover Lamb. Most of the teachings about the Passover Lamb and how Jesus is the Passover Lamb comes from the writings of Paul. He testified to it again and again and again in teaching about the Passover. Paul was not mostly teaching Jews. He was mostly serving missions amongst the Gentiles. And as he taught them of Jesus Christ and of his resurrection and of his crucifixion, he also taught them of the Passover. And these newly converted Christians started celebrating the Passover as a way to get closer to Christ. Now, here are some symbols of how Christ is the Passover Lamb. I have some of the directions from the Old Testament about the Passover Lamb, and you'll see the way it's reflected in Jesus Christ. Select a year-old male lamb without blemish or defect that is pure. The head of the household takes to slaughter the lamb at twilight, taking care that none of its bones were broken. This is a prophecy of Christ and his crucifixion. They were to apply some of its blood to the tops and sides of the door frames of their house, and the lamb was to be roasted and eaten. The applying it to the door frames of the house was part of the law of Moses. And Paul teaches us that now the lamb of the blood of the lamb is to be applied to our hearts. Instead of a literal angel of death coming among us, there's a spiritual angel of death. And if we have the blood of the lamb on our hearts, we'll be protected just as the children of Israel that gathered in their homes. The partaking of the lamb being roasted and eaten, was highly symbolic because as you took its flesh into yourself, it was accepting of the sacrifice of the lamb. It was accepting how the lamb gave its life and its remission of sins. This was part of the law of sacrifice that is recorded in the Old Testament or the Old Covenant. When Jesus came to John the Baptist bore testimony of, "Behold the Lamb of God," referring to Christ's mission and journey and who he was to the people He was truly a lamb. And that teaches us powerfully of who he was. He wasn't a lion. He wasn't a fierce beast. He was a lamb, meek and lowly, willing to offer himself. So I included some things here about how the Passover lamb, the sacrifice of the Passover lamb was done. Christ was crucified on the Passover. And at the very time that he was crucified, that is when the Passover lamb was taken to the temple and laid upon the altar, and the hands placed over its head, and the sins of the people given to the lamb, and its blood shed for the sins of the people. And just as the lamb symbolically took upon our sins, and the children of Israel sacrificed the lamb in order to signal their willingness to receive it, Christ allowed himself to be sacrificed as a lamb so that he could take upon him our sins. And so we could apply the blood of his sacrifice to the doorways of our hearts and to our minds and receive the protection offered therein. Now, the Passover lamb is the most central and powerful symbol of the Passover, but the Passover was also an opportunity that Christ took to teach the people and to give us the sacrament. Sitting at the Passover table, Christ, who had previously taught that he was the bread of life, picked up the matzah, picked up the bread, and said, this is my body. And as he passed it around, this is my body is a shocking thing to say, for this is the bread of the Passover is Matzo Bread. It's an apokemon. It has previously been buried. They wrap it in a cloth, and the children take and hide it. And then it has to be bought with a price and brought back. And that bread that is bought with a price and brought back and is very dear is the bread that Christ took for the Passover and said, this is my body. And he passed it around. And as the disciples took the symbolic body of Christ into their bodies in a sacramental moment, the first sacramental moment, it is like accepting his sacrifice and accepting what he has done for us and receiving his blessings. And he passed it around to each of his disciples. And today we still practice the sacrament in memorial of that moment and to physically signal our commitment to do the same. I think that's one of the reasons why the sacrament is a valuable experience, because it changes our hearts, it changes our minds. And if we want to understand the sacrament better, we can understand it by putting it into context. Things are much clearer when they're put into context. There's all confusion when you take things out of context. And putting the sacrament in the context of the Passover can deepen our understanding, can enliven our worship, can enliven our sacraments to be more powerful and more symbolic of what Christ intended it to be. And this is the prayer from the records that we have of the Last Supper, the first sacrament. Now, the bread is only one part of the sacrament. The next part of the sacrament is the cup. To understand the cup of the sacrament, we need to understand that in the Passover, there are 4 cups. We have lost many of the traditions that come from partaking of a cup. Now, of course, we use it in sacramental moments, but partaking of a cup, particularly drinking it together, is very similar to breaking bread together. Taking a cup together would be as part of a marriage ceremony of a husband and wife becoming one. Whenever a treaty would be made, it would be made by taking a cup and drinking of the cup to seal the treaty. It was used to seal business deals. It was used to seal connections. In all the covenants that the Lord gave to the ancient Israel, it was sealed with a cup. And the 4 cups of the sacrament each have a symbolic meaning that can help us understand what the cup of the sacrament means. To understand the cups of the Passover, we need to go back to the promise of deliverance. When the children of Israel were in bondage in Egypt, they prayed to the Lord for deliverance, and he gave the children of Israel this promise of, I will bring you out from the burdens of the Egyptians. I will deliver you from slavery to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched hand, and with great acts of judgment, I will take you to be my people. These are considered the 4 covenants. I will bring you, I will deliver you, I will redeem you, I will take you. And the next verse has the promise of a promised land in them. I will give you a land. So for each of these covenants, to accept them and take them during the Passover, each one is accepted with a cup. These are the cups there. I will bring you, I will rescue you, I will redeem you, and I will take you. And I will take you as my people, and I will be your God. These are the promises that are accepted, as in olden days, with the drinking of a cup. It is the 3rd cup, the I will redeem you. That is the cup that Christ used in the Last Supper for the sacrament cup, the cup of redemption. And then the I will take you as my people, and I will be your God. That is the cup that, if you remember, that Christ left on the table. He said, I will not drink, I will not partake of the cup until I partake it new with you in the kingdom of heaven. He had not yet worked out the atonement. He had not yet done the work. Until he did, he wasn't going to partake of that cup. The poignancy of Christ leaving a full cup on the table is particularly poignant when we remember Christ's words from the cross of, I thirst. He was thirsty. He had left a cup and hadn't drinking it because he wasn't ready to. He hadn't yet worked out the work of redemption from the 3rd cup. And so he did not yet partake of the 4th cup. He left that on the table and has promised to drink that with us. That's one of the prophecies of the cup. So this cup is part of the sacrament, and the bread is part of the sacrament. And when we look at the Passover feast, it is all pointing to ways that we can become closer to him. That's his desire, that we become closer to him. And each of these symbols teach us something about his personality and his love and his promises. And they're part of being a covenant people that partake of the covenant that he has to offer. He said to his disciples before the Passover, this was recorded by Luke, with desire, I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. He had desire to share the Passover with them. And I think he has desire to share the Passover with us. He's saying to us, I have desire to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. The Passover table was a teaching table. At the Passover table, Christ took moments to teach some of the most profound and powerful doctrines of his ministry. I meant to have a bookmark here, actually. Just let me look up the listing of all the things that he taught as he had his disciples sitting at the table. This is a pattern that Christ often had. Remember when he, after he was resurrected, how he sat on the beach and cooked fish. And as the disciples came into the beach, he fed them first and then he taught them. Remember the feeding of the 5,000 and feeding of the 3,000? Part of his physically teaching them, he would sit down and physically feed them. And then he would give them physical food. This is a pattern for how he teaches. And I think that when we have a Passover meal together, we are also conforming to that pattern, to sit down, break bread together, to eat physically. And when we're filled, then he has some things to teach us to fill our spiritual hearts and minds. So these are some of the things that he taught during the Passover sacrament. First and most powerful was the teaching of another comforter. This is the promise of the second comforter. This is the promise that he will literally come back and come and be with us after he has died and been resurrected and has left our presence. He still works and walks and lives and loves his people. And he's promised the second comforter, that we can still have connection with him, even though he is no longer physically upon the earth. A common refrain in the Passover is, I am the true vine. And so he took this moment to teach about what the true vine means, which is also symbolic in that the fruit of the vine is used to make the wine that we drink for the sacrament and as we accept his covenants. He also taught about the hatred of the world If the world hate you, know that it hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love its own. But ye are not of the world, because I have chosen ye out of the world. Therefore the world hateth you. This promise was made at the Passover table, warning and teaching the disciples for the days and times that would come. It was a time of preparation for the things that would come, which is also symbolic of what the Passover is. He gave warnings to the disciples of how they'd be put out of the synagogues, which is many of us have also been put out of churches. And so we could understand the value of knowing a little ahead of time what is coming so that we can prepare for it. He taught about the opposition of joy and sorrow, and about, for the joy of a man is born into the world, and you therefore have sorrow, but I will see you again, and your heart shall rejoice, and your joy shall no man take from you. He also prophesied about his flock being scattered. And then he gave one of the most powerful promises of his ministry, that in me ye may have peace. These things I have spoken unto you, that in me ye might have peace in the world. In the world you shall have tribulation, but be of good cheer, for I have overcome the world. And I think that as we sit at the Passover table, it is a wonderful opportunity to go over the promises of the Passover and the teachings of the Passover. At the conference, we won't be able to sit at a table, but we will be able to go step by step through the Passover and to learn the symbols and to contemplate what freedom means in our own lives. I have here a little video about freedom. What happened to it? There it is. If you'll give me just a minute to put it on, I think it's a good way to explain the power of freedom. It's not just something that's symbolic.
Captain, my captain.
Go, Captain, my captain.
Sit down. Is hereby dismissed.
I think one thing it shows us is the power of symbols as a way of teaching, which is one of the things that the Passover is all about. Jesus is our deliverance. What will you do with your freedom is the question I have to ask. I'm live. Okay. Thank you, sweetie. Okay, so I really did want to ask if anybody had any questions. I can go through the Passover step by step if there is interest in that. I didn't know if everyone wanted to go through every step of the Passover or if you wanted just an overview. I prepared an overview, but I also have the step by step of every part of the Passover if you're interested in that. Can't hear.
I don't see any comments or questions as of yet. Well, maybe Janine has something.
Let's do the overview.
Okay, I just need to go to that slide presentation. Okay, The little booklet that is guide you through each step of the Passover. The Passover is sometimes called the Seder feast, and that little booklet is called the Haggadah. And this is a slideshow of each step in the Haggadah. One of the calls of the Passover is let all who are hungry come and eat. And when you think about symbolic hunger, that can be a pretty powerful message. Also, just so you know, I have made a Haggadah for the remnant groups that are interested in that, and I've got a free PDF to that, or it's also on Amazon, whichever you prefer. Okay, so first I start with the promise of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The commandment given before the law of Moses, it's not part of the law of Moses, it was written before that, is to keep this ordinance forever. It is the only other commandment that has been given like that in all your generations forever is the commandment to keep the Sabbath day holy. Those two commandments were practiced on the first in the beginning of the world and are prophesied to still be in practice on the last day of the world. And then I've already talked about Christ's desire to eat this Passover with us. My time is at hand, and I will keep the Passover at your house. I think that's one of his promises, to come to our house. He'll recognize the house because he'll recognize it is his blood that he shed and how it is accepted in that house, and he will come to that house. The Passover begins with a simple ceremony that begins every Sabbath, and that is called the blessing of the light, where the mother lights 2 candles and sings or says a prayer for her family. The prayer can be a simple recitation of scripture. Often it is a prayer that is just from her heart for her children. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the movie The Fiddler on the Roof, but in The Fiddler on the Roof, on the Sabbath day, the mother and the father sing a song to their children, praying for their daughters and praying for their hopes for the blessing of their families. And it's really beautiful. It captures the spirit of the blessing of the light. The mother blesses the light to bring the spirit to her table. And as her family gathers around, she prays for them. And that brings the spirit of the Sabbath into the home. And this is one of the Sabbath prayers that is really beautiful. But the thing is that the Passover is not one of those prescribed prayers that need to be said exactly. The prayers of the Passover are not like the sacrament prayers that need to, or the baptismal prayers. They are more like our private prayers in that there is variation as each family prays as they are led. Many of them sing the prayers. Many of them have traditional prayers that are said in their family, and many times it is ad-libbed as the Spirit guides. After the mother says the prayer, often the father says the prayer. It is traditional for the father to bless his sons and the mothers to bless her daughters and to compare them to the people of the scriptures and enjoin the children to be as faithful as those in the scriptures. These are some of the prayers that parents pray for their children. May the Lord bless and keep thee and cause his presence to shine upon thee. Passover is a festival of freedom, so it is appointment that appropriate that it is set apart by the warm glow of candles. Christ, our Passover, is sanctified for us. Here's the promise of Exodus that I already talked about, the fourfold promise that all those years in bondage, the children of Israel clung to and longed for. This is how they knew that the Lord would send a deliverer to them, because he promised, I will deliver you. I will deliver you from slavery. So they knew the Lord would send them a deliverer, and they had faith in that promise, even in the darkest days of their bondage. These are the 4 cups and the Matzo Bread, each one a covenant cup about accepting part of his promises to us, accepting his deliverance. And here's the promise for the first cup, that accepting the first cup, the cup of sanctification, the Lord takes us as we are and he sanctifies us. Everyone would raise the cup, say the blessing either together or led by someone leading the table, usually the father, about how blessed the Lord is. It's accepted in gratitude to raise the cup, give thanks. And then there's a very interesting tradition to drink of the cup while you lean to the left. This is kind of interesting because this has totally been lost in our modern world. But when the children of Israel were in slavery, they didn't have the freedom to sit together at a table and enjoy a meal. They would grab their food and eat it in the fields and eat what they could. They described it as eating like animals. But to be able to sit at a table and to partake of your food with your right hand and hold your cup in your left hand, and you lean to the left to say that I am a free person able to make and receive covenants with the Lord, and that lean to the left to accept it. This is described in the New Testament when, the disciple that leaned on Jesus's bosom, as they all leaned so their right hand would be free to eat and their left hand would be free to hold the cup. And then after they partake of the cup, so the Lord has already promised them deliverance, already taken them in their unclean state and offered them a promise. But the first thing he does when the Lord takes us in our unclean state is ask us to wash. This is a ceremonial washing of the hands that is done at the Passover. Before eating, each person washes their hands so that they may become clean. And when everyone sits at the table with clean hands, the table is considered an altar or a holy place. And their hands are washed by one another. Usually a priesthood holder would pour the water across the hands. And then the first thing, once everyone is clean and sitting at the teaching table, the bread of affliction is brought forth, the Matzo Bread. The bread has no leaven in it for two reasons. First, because the children of Israel literally didn't have time for the bread to rise when the call came to leave Egypt. But also because, as Christ taught when he talked about beware the leaven of the Pharisees, bread that is leavened goes bad. It gets moldy. It doesn't last for very long. But unleavened bread has a durability. It has a perseverance. It doesn't go bad. It's hard like a cracker, but it doesn't go bad. I think some of you know of hardtack, the hard unleavened bread that soldiers would eat like on ships or in armies. As a matter of fact, when I'm trying to remember what happened in the anyway, there are several times when there was unleavened bread that was like 6 or 7 years old that was still good to be eaten because it was unleavened. So that uncorruptibility is part of the reason why the symbol of the bread that is given the children is unleavened. This afokiman is taken, and the leader of the table breaks it in half and places one half of it in an envelope, and it is buried to be brought out again at the end of the meal. When it is brought out again at the end of the meal is when Christ will give us the gift of the sacrament.
What I like about, oh, sorry,
What?
Jen, I was just going to comment on two things, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I was just going to comment on, I was really impressed the first time we did the Passover of the family focus, that it was a ordinance or an event that was presided over by, first off, a mother giving the blessing of light, and I also enjoyed that part of the Sabbath. So to me, it made the family more the focus, and it also is, I mean, you're going through the symbols of this, but what's interesting, it sounds like, oh, it's the same every time. No, it's not. It's like, as you go through, there's so much opportunities to go different directions depending on who's there, and that's the other thing I like about that. And anyway, so then when you get to the bread and you see what they were doing, it makes more sense, the sacrament, like you were talking about earlier. And anyway, I just I'm a big fan, and just wanted to kind of comment on those couple things so far that I thought were important. So thanks, Jen.
Yeah, I've noticed as we've done the Passover every year, is that every year the Lord has something different to teach us. Every year something different stands out to us. And I think that has to do with our own preparation in some ways, what we're ready to receive. So then the first cup is poured. This is the second cup. This is the cup of deliverance. And we pour this cup because we want to receive it. We want to be delivered. But the thing is we pour this cup and we do not drink it. We're not yet ready or worthy to partake of this deliverance. There's some commandments we need to fulfill first. We cannot take of deliverance yet because we have not yet taught our children. So we pour this cup and then we stop because the children have some questions. You shall tell your children. The 4 questions asked by children. Now, this is really important. As you know, Denver has talked at length about the importance of asking questions. He illustrates this in 2 ways. One is by talking about the Nephites and how they did not ask about the other sheep, and so the answer was not given. They were given an opportunity to ask. And then one, his own personal experience, when he had an experience with an angelic messenger who waited around for him to ask a question, and he never asked a question. If you don't ask a question, then you aren't ready to receive the answer. And the thing is not only do we have a commandment to teach our children, but children have a lot of questions. And generally, as they grow up, they start asking fewer and fewer questions. And as parents wanting to teach our children on their spiritual journey, one of the things modeled in the Passover is how to encourage our children to ask questions, how to take their questions seriously, to take the time to answer them, and to listen to our children. That is part of the teaching process of teaching our children. The 4 questions. Oh, sorry. Yes.
Somebody had a question. I was actually just going to comment today. I was having a conversation about asking questions, and I think one of the things that the difficult thing about asking this question is you have to acknowledge you don't know. That's why you're asking it. And I think sometimes there's a humility in saying, I'm sure as Christ talking, some of them are like, didn't understand, and yet they were afraid to say, well, what do you mean by all this? What do you mean by that? And so that's why it's important that we ask questions. I actually think that's one of the things as a people that we need to learn, is that we're afraid to say, okay, we don't understand this. What do we do as a people? How do we come together? And because that connotates that we mean we don't know. So anyway, so there's a humility that goes along with being willing to ask a question, that a child is not afraid to ask questions because they know they don't know, as been said. So anyway.
Yeah, they know they don't know. And the first question is the most basic of all. Why is this meal so different from other nights? Why is this night different than all other nights? The first and most basic question. The next question is, why are we eating this matzah? Why are we eating this flat, unleavened bread? Why on this night do we eat bitter herbs? And we dip them, not once, but twice. Why are we doing this strange ritual? Why are we dipping herbs in salt water? And the gossip, and this is the promise about the bitter herbs are partially symbolic of the hyssop that was used to spread the blood on the doorways. And as we dip it in water, we remember what it takes to spread blood on the doorway. But it's also symbolic of tears shed. Most obviously, the tears of the children of Israel in bondage, and how horrible their enslavement was, and how they cried out to the Lord for freedom. But I myself have a wound concealed. We all have tears that, as Nephi said, water our pillows at night. We all have sorrows that only the Lord can see. And part of the Passover is claiming his promise to heal our sorrows and to heal our hearts. He sees our tears, and he promises to wipe them dry. The tears of affliction as it drops off a leaf. And then the last question, why on this night do we eat lamb? I've already talked a bit about what the lamb is symbolic of. And here's a list of the ways in which the Passover lamb is symbolic of Christ. It's sinlessness, it's submissiveness, it's willingness to die, no broken bones. And it's a powerful symbol of who Christ is. He is meek and lowly, and that is why we drink, why we have lamb. The answers to the questions should be tailored to the child's age and understanding. As we grow, we can receive more answers. But here are some of the answers to the 4 questions. Why do we eat matzah? Why is it a symbol of freedom? It's because literally the children of Israel didn't have time to bake their bread. and figuratively because leaven is a symbol of corruption, and because the Lord wants us to be without corruption. And then we partake of the matzah. The bitter herbs, the life has both bitterness and sweetness, and there is no life without some bitterness, and also without the joys and promises of sweetness. The sharpness of the bitterness awakes our senses, and we experience it together. We partake of the bitter herbs. This reclining question was added actually by the Jews when they stopped having lamb at their Passover. It's very interesting that one of the most powerful symbols of the Passover has been taken out of the Jewish Passover. The reason why was the destruction of the temple by Tiberius was so, it broke their hearts, literally. It damaged their culture, it damaged who they were. And they feel like without a temple to offer sacrifice at, that they cannot offer sacrifice of a lamb. So for the fourth question, the child asks, why do we recline? And it is another symbol, like the first two, a symbol of freedom. And then here's the original question, why do we eat of the lamb? By taking the time to teach the children, we remind ourselves of the
Hey,
Passover.
Jen, here's a question for you. Why do you think that fourth question was removed?
The fourth question about partaking of the lamb was removed because they don't have lamb in their Passover anymore. They have a shank bone to be symbolic of the lamb, but they're not actually eating lamb. So it wouldn't be right, it'd be confusing for children to ask questions about a lamb that isn't at the table. And so they switched it out from the question about the lamb to a question about why are you reclining. So that's why.
I find it fascinating that in a way they took the Lamb of God out because
Yeah.
it's just the symbolism of even the history of the Passover, and then how they slowly lost some things. To me, it should be cautionary to us, because we're like, I looked at our LDS background and how we just eventually didn't have some things, and we're like, oh, we don't need that, and discard some of that, and we lose stuff whenever we do that. Anyway, that's just thought I was interesting.
Yeah, we have a long history of saying, oh, the Jews are fallen people, the Jews were so foolish, whatever. We're fallen people too. We have made the exact same mistakes. Their stories are important because they can warn us and remind us and to bring to light some of our own shortcomings. And it's actually very humbling to look at the mistakes the Jews made, because they are not unique to the Jews. We are also a fallen people.
Yeah, I think that's why it's so important to me. We shouldn't hold ourselves up as any better. If anything, we should be grateful for their example and try to learn everything, and not put them down, because it's our nature to kind of fail in the ways that we do.
Yeah. And with teaching about the ways we fail and about our bondages, our shortcomings, our wicked traditions, our things that we don't even know that we're getting wrong, that's a good reminder of the promise to bring us out of bondage. The bondage can also be the bondage of our false traditions, the bondage of our pride, the bondage of the things we think we know. Those things can also be a type of bondage. And what the Lord's blessing and mission and what he wants to give us is to bring us out of bondage.
Labored, I didn't think of this before, but the bondage of being under a false religion too. I mean, think of how much time and how many tasks we had with our old religion that kept us so busy that we didn't have time to read the scriptures, or to take time with family. I mean, it's been a whole new discovery being out of the church for years, and then figuring out how to be a family again without having all this busy stuff to do. So
I put this slide here of Nephi making the plates to remind us of a moment in the Book of Mormon when Nephi desired to teach his brothers. And the way he taught them was by telling them the story of the deliverance of the children of Israel. He went into great detail of describing the story of deliverance that we're retelling tonight. And my personal feeling is that the reason why they were sitting together and telling the story was because they were celebrating the Passover. That is one of the ways in which the Passover is manifest in the Book of Mormon, is Nephi retelling it to his brothers. And here is the promise of the Lord from the Passover, that wherever we are driven in all the lands that they are taken to, the Lord will bring us back. The Lord will, and the promise of bringing the lost 10 tribes out of the north country where they've driven, and they will also be brought back, is also part of the promise of the Passover. They will be miraculously brought over water, just like the children of Israel were miraculously led across the Red Sea. And the power of the story, those 2 slides I showed before, it's the power of teaching as a family. And then we go into the story of Moses, of how he was laid in a basket made of reeds and papyrus, sealed with pitch and with bitumen, and how his mother set him forth, which is a tremendous act of faith, sent him forth on the Nile, and how he was drawn up out of the Nile and given the Egyptian name Moses, for he was drawn out of the Nile. And Moses's the most important moment of Moses's life is when he received the calling from God at the burning bush, where he met God, and God said, "I am that I am," and then gave him a job to do. Let my people go. He went to Pharaoh, which must have been a very scary thing to do, and said, "Let my people go." Now, part of the Passover, of going through the story of the children of Israel's bondage, is to go through each of the 10 plagues. And as we go through each of the 10 plagues, we have a cup in front of us. And this cup, sometimes called the cup of joy, with the mention of each plague, the participants at the Passover table are asked to take a drop out of their cup of joy, because our joys are lessened when other people suffer, even the suffering of our enemies. The children of Israel practice an emotional, empathetic exercise to feel the sorrows of the Egyptians that held them in bondage. Think of what that means, to go through each plague and imagine it as if we were Egyptians, and to know that the price of our freedom is very high. This is a really powerful story that also touches on the power of empathy. I shared it in the last meeting when I announced this class, but let me go over it again. It's a story from a rabbi who has a man come to him and says, Rabbi, will you please pray for my business? And the rabbi says, oh, I have heard that you have a brother who is suffering, and yet you are not helping your brother. And the man says, yes, I cannot help my brother. My business is suffering. Like I said, I cannot help him. And the rabbi said that when the children of Israel were in bondage, they cried to the Lord. And the scripture says, I too have heard the sighs of the children of Israel. If the Lord was just hearing the cries of the children of Israel, he'd just say, I hear the cries of the children of Israel, but I too have heard the cries of the children of Israel, implies that they are hearing each other's cries, that they are seeing the suffering of their brothers and their sisters that are laboring beside them. As they see and their hearts draw out for the suffering of others, that is what brings the power of heaven, so that the Lord hears their cries and brings deliverance to the children of Israel. And that I too have heard the sighs of the children of Israel is one of the, as we hear each other's cries, that's one of the keys to unlock the windows of heaven and bring deliverance in our own life. And upon hearing the story, the man resolved that he would help his brother so that he could receive the blessings that the Lord had for him. The first plague is the plague of blood, where Moses laid out his staff and the river Nile turned to blood. An important thing to remember about this, as the land of Egypt thirsted, the children of Israel who had been obedient had water in their houses, because Miriam had previously told them to gather up all the water, enough for 3 days. So while the land around them, they had pure water to drink. The next plague was the plague of frogs, which must have been pretty terrible. The descriptions of the scripture about it being in their beds and in their ovens and in their clothing makes it clear this was a pretty intense plague of frogs. And you take another drop out of your cup and place it on your plate. Next plague was the plague of lice, Sitting at my table, I ask everybody to scratch themselves and know what lice feels like in an empathetic way. Right? It was a truly terrible plague. The interesting thing is this plague was begun by Moses throwing some dust in the air, and the dust turned to lice. The next is the Plague of Aurov, which is translated in Hebrew as a swarm. And so everybody's wondered what this is a plague of swarms. Many people call it the plague of wild beasts. That's another translation. Large wild beasts don't really swarm. It is usually insects that swarm. Bees swarm, but they are not dangerous and they don't sting. But mosquitoes also swarm, and they are a plague to be reckoned with. So I personally think this might be a swarm of mosquitoes that are plaguing the Egyptians. Next is the plague upon the cows, the disease upon the cows. The Egyptians, like the Hindu of today, had a sacred cow. The cow was considered their mother. One of their negative confessions in the afterlife, I don't know how much you know of the Egyptian religion, but they would have their heart weighed on a scale with a feather, an ostrich feather on one side and their heart on the other. And they would need to answer questions. Have you ever lied? Have you ever stolen sacred meat? Have you ever offended a cow? And that's one of the things they're expected to be asked in the afterlife, because they consider the cow to be so sacred. We know how sacred it was to them because Aaron built a golden calf once they were in the wilderness. It was a powerful symbol to the Egyptians. And yet the cows across the land were struck with boils and were struck down, showing that they weren't divine, they were mortal and subject to the God of Israel. Next is the plague of boils. Pretty horrible plague. It affected even Pharaoh himself. One of the things about having boils is it meant that they could not go into their temples and they could not worship, because if you were unclean, ceremoniously unclean, you could not go into the temples. So when they were all plagued with boils, they were separated from all of their gods and from going into the temple. And there's the plague of fire, the hail that fell and burst into flames and became fire upon the land. This destroyed the crops. Probably at this point, it was the crops of flax and barley that were used mostly for libations, for offering to the gods, and for the making of clothing. This next plague, the Plague of Locus, would have been the plague that destroyed their food crops. This would be the plague that was devastating for that reason. The Plague of Locus, which we still remember today. I have a locust. And then there's a plague that has some very interesting discussions because of its parallel with the Book of Mormon, is the Plague of Darkness. This one must have been terrifying to the Egyptians because they worshiped the sun god. They worshiped Ra, and to have the sun god itself darkened, a darkness that was so dark it was thick. They described it as thick. And the darkness descended upon all the land, but the children of Israel had light in their houses. To have light in the darkness is a pretty powerful symbol and a pretty important blessing for those of us who want to claim it. The parallel with the Book of Mormon is, of course, the 3 days of darkness that attended Christ's crucifixion before his appearance in the New World. And then the last plague of all, the death of the firstborn across Egypt. When I'm sitting at the Passover table, I ask all the firstborn to rise. And if you are a firstborn, then your life is considered to be saved, literally saved by God, and that you owe God your life. The firstborn would receive the birthright and had a responsibility to be a priest and a temporal provider to the others in their family. And they were literally losing that with the death of the firstborn, as well as the firstborn of Pharaoh was losing the next Pharaoh, the next king. And this is the plague, the horrible plague for which the blood of the Lamb was offered to protect the family, to protect the firstborn. That is why the Lamb was sacrificed. The plague of the firstborn. This was later changed to the children of Israel. The priest, instead of being the firstborn of each family, having a duty to the priesthood and to serve in the temple, this job was given to the Levites, and it was their job to be a priest unto all the other tribes. But in the beginning, it was each family. had a priest. All people in every generation see themselves as having experienced the Exodus from Egypt. This is a personal story. It's not just an ancient story from long ago. This symbolic journey is all of our journeys. And then the miraculous crossing of the Red Sea. This is symbolic of baptism, of going through the water and to come out the other side a new person and a new people, a free people. The people that were forged as a nation through this experience, a people that brought the whole idea of monotheism to the world, that worshipped many gods. This forged them into something that they never were before. This separated them from the land of Egypt. They could never go back and be the way they were before once they had crossed the water of the great deep. And on the other side of crossing the Red Sea, that is when Miriam sings her fantastic hymn of gratitude. And they sang and rejoiced when they arrived in the Promised Land. Well, and they on the other side, they still had a bit of a journey before they got to the Promised Land. And at this part of the Passover meal, a song of gratitude.
If I could comment on the plagues. There was in the comments, Michelle commented how everyone was focused on the Egyptian gods and showing their falsehood. And what I like about the Passover is how it points to our day. And so if these plagues kind of challenge the false gods of those days, what I wonder is, like, as the Passover comes for us in this day, I mean, this is kind of a thought question. What are the false gods of today that will be challenged? And how will they be challenged? How will they be shown to have no power, and then ultimately for us to be delivered? Anyway, that's just a thought question for everybody.
Oh, thank you, dear. So after the deliverance is the time of gratitude. There is a song, a traditional song of Daenu. Daenu translates to "it would have been enough." And it has hundreds of verses going through all the ways that the Lord has blessed his people and saying it would have been enough if you had just done this bit, but you kept doing it. It would have been enough if you had just given us the scriptures at Sinai. It would have been enough if you had just delivered us from Egypt. It would have been enough if you had just given us the gift of your presence. But the Lord keeps giving and giving and giving. And so it's a song of gratitude and of thank you. And it's quite a catchy song. It's really a fun one. Mm-hmm. And at this point in the Passover meal, up to this point, we assume that Christ's Passover with his 12 disciples was very traditional. But here Christ broke tradition. He changed the Passover. He changed the way things usually were done. Now they usually have a second washing of the hands after crossing the Red Sea, another sanctifying moment. But Christ changed the Passover and he washed the disciples' feet. And he says, that ye should do as I have done to you. This is different than the washing of the feet between a husband and a wife. This is a different ordinance, and Christ made them clean by kneeling before them as a servant, washing their feet.
Yeah, we've only done that. Have we done that? We've done that once or twice, right? In the last 13, 14 years.
Yeah, when we've gathered people around our table, some people are really excited for that ordinance and other people feel rather uncomfortable with it. So it's really important to follow the spirit of your table and to follow the spirit of who feels comfortable with that.
Yeah, I wanted to make sure people understand that it's part of that is just the Passover. We're not necessarily, because obviously the washing of the feet is another ordinance that Christ and the temple and other things will do. So it's typically we kind of skip over it because it's more of an intimate thing, and
even the conversation around it is very intimate. Is I believe it was Peter that said, Lord, don't wash me. You shouldn't be washing me. And he says, if I do not wash you, then you have no part of me. And then he says, well, don't just wash my feet, wash my head and my hands too. And he says, no, I'm washing your feet. And so, it's a conversation about how the Lord serves us.
Yeah, I mean, it points to things that will come later, and and we know that yeah, certain things have their order. So
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. And after the disciples were washed, then this is the part of the Passover where the afokinon, the bread of affliction that was broken earlier and buried, is brought forth again. And Christ took this bread and said, "This is my body." And he passed it around and asked everyone to partake of his body in a symbolic way, to take upon us his sacrifice. And then he picked up his cup and he said, "This is the cup of the new covenant in my blood, which is shed for you. Drink ye all of it, and this ye do in remembrance of me." This is pretty powerful symbol, particularly for a Jewish mind, because there's some pretty strong commandments in the Old Testament or the Old Covenant about thou shalt not drink blood. That's a forbidden thing. And Christ says, "This is my blood. Drink ye therefore all of it." And he offers them this cup. And they all drank it. They all took up on them, and it became part of their flesh. It was part of receiving him, was partaking of the sacrament cup, the cup of redemption, partaking symbolic of his redemption. The symbol of the matzah and the Passover lamb. Now's the part of the meal where it's called the Hillel sandwich. After the children of Israel lost their temple and were taken in captivity, a rabbi named Hillel proposed that in remembrance of the temple that they no longer have, that they bring together the symbols of the bitterness of the herbs, the sweetness of the horset of the apples, symbolic of the mortar. It also is a dual symbol. It has another symbol, and that is that there is a legend among the Jews that when Pharaoh gave his very wicked command to kill all the male children born of Israel, that the pregnant women would go into hiding before they gave birth, and they would hide amongst the orchards, in the apple orchards, and they would give birth there to avoid Pharaoh's soldiers. So their midwives would meet them, and they would look for a safe place to bring forth their children. And so the apples of the horset is symbolic of our love and protection of our children, trying to protect them of the world and try to keep them safe. And so we add that to the sandwich along with the Matzo bread, the bread that is uncorrupted. And we put it together in a sandwich because bringing all these symbols together that point to Christ in a pretty powerful way, that symbolizes what they lost with the temple. They lost the access to their God, the ability to go into the Holy of Holies. The veil to the Holy of Holies was rent in two, and they could no longer enter the temple. And their longing to again be blessed with the temple is symbolized by putting these symbols together and to dream of the day when they can come back into the presence of their God. And partaking of this and feeling that feeling of our longing for the Lord is part of partaking of this bittersweet sandwich. And then the meal is served. And it should be a feast. It should be served in joy and thanksgiving. It should be plentiful and nourishing. We should serve one another. And it's been a long time, as you can imagine. All the symbols we've gone through takes a little while as you sit around the table. So usually everyone's very hungry when the food is offered. It is a chance to rejoice together and to discuss and to share blessings and to feast.
I just wanted to comment about how the symbols, there's so much symbology that focuses on the Savior and the Messiah, that it's amazing how they missed when he come. And so I always think, I don't blame them. I think, what am I missing that's right before me, that's pointing directly to answers, and I'm missing, And so I know if they did it, that I'm doing that. And so it's really powerful wondering what teachings, what symbols, what things in my life am I missing that I ought to be seeing, Anyway, that's nothing.
Oh, thank you. Beautiful.
Yeah, I'm in the comments it said eyes that see. Yeah, it's one of the things, me praying that I have a soft heart and that I have ears to hear and eyes to see is so important, because I feel like there's many things, even as there's personal levels, and I was talking with other friends about family, and then levels of us as a covenant people, that what do we miss as a people? What's the things that's right before us that we ought to be doing that we don't see? So anyway, these symbols, I just am reminded of what ought I to be seeing that I may be missing.
Thank you, sweetie. I have lost my place in the, there we go. In the, okay. Where are we? Okay, here we are. I am sorry, everybody. I lost my place. There we are. And then we have the feast, and we rejoice and enjoy our meal together. And at the end of the meal, the Pokemon is the dessert, and the sacrament part. I've already gone over this before. We brought up these slides about how this bread is highly symbolic that Christ used for the sacrament. And it all is pointing to him and how he is coming and how he has blessings for us. It is a prophecy of his death and resurrection. He also was wrapped and buried. And when he says, "This is my body," he meant it in a literal way, for he would be sacrificed. There's a picture of the empty tomb, because just as the Pokemon is brought back up after being buried, he came up again after being buried. And he taught, this is the slide where I go through the stories that I already did of all the great teachings at the teaching table that Christ took an opportunity, because he knew that hard times were coming for his disciples, just as he knows the things that are coming to us. And this gave him an opportunity to teach and prepare so that they would be ready and be blessed when the trials that were ahead were coming. The last cup is the "I will redeem you" cup, and that is the one that he left at the table. The last Passover teaching that Christ gave is one of my favorites. "This new command I give unto you, that ye love one another as I have loved you, so you must love one another." This is right before he makes his sacrifice because of love. And he is declaring his love to his disciples that he walked and talked with. And he's going to show them his love very soon. They're going to sing a hymn, and then he is going to go to the Garden of Gethsemane and do the great work that he did there. But before he goes, he not only expresses his love to them, but he commands them to love one another. And I think this commandment rings down through the ages for us. "I will restore you." This is the cup of restoration. This is not one of the 4 cups. This is the cup of Elijah. Elijah is someone who comes before him and brings tidings of his coming. And it's the cup that he left at the table, the cup of completion. And I think I have another slide. Here it is. One way to fill Elijah's cup is that we each have, if we save a little bit from our last cup in the bottom of our cup, we each pour our bit into Elijah's cup, showing how we each need to do individual acts if we want to receive the promises made to the fathers. So we each fill Elijah's cup, and we each keep his place empty as we wait for him.
You know, I find that that's in our day, this teaching from this kind of years ago, I looked at how can I participate? What can I do in this restoration? I mean, because Elijah comes, God's messenger, and we can talk about who that is, but ultimately it's like, what can I also do in participating? And it can be great or small, it doesn't matter. But I feel like whenever we inquire of the Lord, what can I do? He gives us something to do, and he'll a thought or something, and oftentimes we can go to him and say, what can I do? And he'll lead and guide us, you know. So anyway, I think that's having that willingness inside, that because oftentimes people think, wow, I can't really do anything to help this thing, you know, move forward in life. But it's, if we're moving forward ourselves and trying to help others, that's very important.
Mhm. Thank you. I have a suggestion here about blowing the shofar. The shofar is primarily associated with the Feast of Trumpets. But at the temple in Jerusalem, they would blow the shofar to mark the times and to call to prayer, to mark the holidays. And coincidentally, the shofar was blown about the time that Christ said, "It is finished." And the shofar is meant to be symbolic of our hearts crying out to God, which
You know,
would be an
I
appropriate
know I
time.
shouldn't say this, but oh, sorry.
Mhm.
Sorry, honey. Interesting. Denver is speaking at 3 p.m. That's when we're having them start.
Mhm.
And so we probably ought to blow the shofar when he starts. What do you
Yeah, if
think?
someone's willing to climb the mountain and blow it, that would be fun. Have to find someone who wants to do it. I think.
Yeah, anyway, I just found that interesting because we didn't know that. We just settled on that time. And so he'll be blowing it at the moment when the Passover Lamb was killed. That's just interesting. Sorry.
Mhm. And here's a painting of, I believe this is Elijah, coming of Elijah, because that's what we're looking for. And here is the words that Denver said when he's talking about the "I will pass over you." He's talking about a future Passover at this time. Will gather the wicked into bundles, and I will pass over you as my peculiar treasure. So as we want to claim the promises of a future Passover, perhaps we can gain wisdom through celebrating the Passover of the past. For it is a moment of time that is past, present, and future. And the teachings of deliverance are timeless and something that our hearts long for. And at the end of the Passover, we sang "Next Year in Zion." Next year in Jerusalem is the traditional prayer to end the Passover. And that is the end of my Passover slides. Are there any other thoughts or things people want to discuss?
Yes, I have a question, Jen. Elise here.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. What?
I need to talk to Karen about making the fruit mix, and I was wondering if she could chat with me. I sent her my number.
She's asking for a recipe.
I think, Jen, did you get that question? She wanted the Elise?
No, I'm afraid I didn't hear it. I don't know what went wrong.
I think she asked about the recipes and such. So
Okay, I can post them in this chat, or I can email them to you directly. I have the recipes.
Elise, I'll post I actually posted it earlier in the chat, but the PDF was posted. Let me repost that again so you have that. If you'll click on that when I repost, then you'll have it for good. Okay.
Yeah.
It's in that
The PDF that he's posting is the Passover Haggadah that I wrote up to help us have Passovers, because it's a big thing to do if you weren't raised with it, and we weren't. So to understand like how to do a Passover and to touch the important symbolic parts and the parts that are Christ-centered and focused on the Last Supper are, in my opinion, the most important parts. And so I put all that together, and it's the PDF that Brian can send out to everybody. And it of course has all the recipes in it. They're also all over the internet if you wanted to look it up that way. There's a lot of variation in the diaspora when the Jews were spread out across all the corners of the world in different places. They had different recipes. Whatever local ingredients were available became their traditions. So the Jews in Spain have slightly different recipes than the Jews that were in Russia did. And so as they came back to Israel and became a people, they brought a lot of different traditions and recipes with them. One tradition is that if you are making the horsat, the apples and cinnamon, that you only include ingredients that are from the Song of Solomon, because those are like the symbols of love in the Song of Solomon. But you don't have to follow that tradition. Just find a simple recipe that's easy to scale up, because it's a popular food and it's good to make plenty of it because it's delicious.
So I have a question. Jennifer, what inspires you to take so much time in studying the feast, particularly the Passover? What was it in your life, or what time frame in your life, or what was the influence there? Have you answered that yet?
My daughter just said years ago, because we've been doing this for basically as long as she can remember. I've always felt a kinship to the Jewish people. My mom taught me about them when they were very young, and I developed an interest in the Passover. And so one year when our kids were very young, we did a small one as a family, and the spirit was so strong, and the kids enjoyed it so much, and we all felt like we learned a lot. That every year we've had a Passover, and every year is quite different than the years before. It's an individual holiday. Each family is different. The things the spirit brings out. It's a spirit directed celebration, so it's not about getting all the details right. It's about following where the spirit leads.
Awesome.
Yeah, that's what I like about it, because it's, instead of just this, if it's the same every year, then you're probably not doing it right in a way, because each time you have somebody different with you. So we've had it with our family. We've had it with one of the first times we had it was with David Christensen and Scott Porter from our old ward and his family. Those three families, we had it together, and I think that was the first time we ever did it, wasn't that? Or
no, I think that was the second time. I think I had done it once before.
Oh yeah, that's right. It was the second time we'd done it by ourselves, and so we just liked it because it felt like it brought us closer to the Savior, and built charity within us for the original chosen people, and it taught a lot of humility. Because like I said, I see throughout all the things that were so plain, and I kept thinking, what are we missing? And of course that led eventually to realizing some things about our own religion that were lacking. So it kind of led us out of our own Egypt, of i.e. the church is kind of showing us a broader view, and more importantly, it led us towards the Savior and the Messiah. And that was what was beautiful, and realizing there's a lot of degrees of bondage, both, national and individual and family and other things. So
What's your bloodline? I know Jennifer looks dark haired there. Looks like there might be some bloodline there. What have you found out about your bloodlines?
I don't know of any Jewish ancestors in my history.
We never know. I think that every one of us probably has at least a drop of it, considering the scattering that took place and the vast incorporation of Lamanites into the American Western type locations. So
Abraham was the father of many nations.
Exactly.
yeah. So yeah, we've done it multiple years. We did it for remnant folk. We did it for ward back in the day. She did it for 100 people at our ward here. So back when, about 8-9 years ago, I think. Been a kind of a interesting journey with it all.
Mm-hmm. So one thing I wanted to ask is, in this wilderness conference, we have too many people to be able to sit down and have a meal together, like a Passover meal, a very symbolic meal that it's hard to do with such a large group. And so we've decided that the most important part is the teaching the symbols. And so we've decided to have a walk in the wilderness, beginning at sunset, and kind of a walk of light on a journey, kind of like the journey of the children of Israel to the Promised Land, the journey to freedom, and along each step of the way to teach one of the symbols of the Passover. And we have a couple of stations that we don't have any volunteers for. So if there's anybody that would like to be part of that, we could really use the help to put this journey of light together to help learn about the Passover in a practical way. If you want, I can read to the group the stations that are open for discussion, if you guys want that.
I think that'd be helpful.
Okay. I know there's several people in this chat like you, Lisa, who are already taking a station, and I'm so grateful for that. One of the ones is the covenant of Exodus 6. That's untaken. The I will deliver you, I will bring you, I will promise you. That station is open. The other one is the washing of hands, the sanctification, where we wash our hands. There's another one of the this is my body, where the bread is broken and buried, the Matzo Bread. And my personal feelings is that should be done by someone with the priesthood, if someone is interested in that. And then the station of the sacrament, the sacrament, I also think that should be done with a brother that has the priesthood to teach that principle of the Last Supper sacrament. And then the last station of Elijah's cup is also not taken. So if anyone feels drawn to any of those or would like to participate in some way, those are the stations that are open. There's 5 of them, so I need quite a lot of help still. There's going to be 12 stations in all. It's going to be a beautiful journey, I hope, with so many people helping with it. You're sharing the PDF, dear?
Yeah, here's the stations. We already have some of them. Cup of promise to deliver, gratitude, washing the hands. We already have some people that are doing it.
I've got an updated list here. Not all of the names are in there as far as.
Oh, you got it. Okay. Anyway, so that's the list, and then we can send this out. It has all the information, and it's each individual, however they feel led to do it. That's what's important. Again, I say that I love this because it teaches one to do their own study, and then if you're doing it, it's because you're there and the Lord's speaking through you. So you, and then the people that are there, you interact, and so the Spirit is the one that teaches and brings life to this. So.
Also, if somebody doesn't want a particular station but wants to help, we could use some ushers to help the groups move along and form so they're not too large. And so ushers are also needed if anyone wants to help.
Yeah. So what future Passover too? That was one of the questions. That's why we studied this Passover, because is recognizing the Lord's hand and how people have to, but I think the challenge is to trust the Lord in all that. I mean, when Moses was going through all those plagues and the people were, I think it was supposed to build faith too, as they saw the falling of the false gods. Hopefully it built faith in the Lord, and so there's, again, I just encourage people to study these things, because always it's Book of Mormon's the same way. Anything that's in there, usually a type of what happened in the past is usually what's going to happen in the future. Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to close by bringing it around. I told the story of a modern Passover experience of people being delivered from bondage. And I think that there are many Passover experiences, many deliverances that the Lord is working upon his people. And so that is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. I really appreciate it. As you can tell, the Passover is dear to my heart, and I appreciate an opportunity to share it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Jennifer. I mean, I think this is a perfect time, especially the coming up conference, right? To celebrate Passover as Passover is happening. I think if prepared for, there can be an amazing spirit there. So, I mean, it's a wonderful opportunity that we have to celebrate Passover as a group of people. Again, not so much in remembrance of what happened, but also looking forward to what will. So,
Yeah. I think it's really cool too, because so at the conference and even worldwide, if whoever's not there during that night, you can have the Passover, do it whatever big or small you want, and knowing that throughout the the world that the covenant people are trying to honor that feast, and also to know that that night, as Denver gives us that talk, then after we can retire to our tents and our other things, and even if we're at home and kind of ponder these things. So I'm just excited that it's like it's neat that to me it's like it's building one heart with us, and I think that's one of the purposes of the feast, or of any the eventual feast that will be restored, is that they're meant to weave our hearts together with one another. So
right, and this is one of the few things that as a people we can actually celebrate. I mean, if you think about even your LDS tradition, like what did we actually celebrate within the church, right? The traditional like Christmas and Easter. I mean, even then, like there really wasn't much of a celebration, at least with the symbolism
Yeah.
that we need to have.
Actually, that is why the Passover was dropped from Christian celebrations. There was a Pope, Victor the First, and he wrote an Easter liturgy, some songs and scriptures to be read on Easter morning. And he felt like he was being upstaged by the Passover that families were having the night before. And people were already debating what day to have the Passover because of the differences between a solar calendar and a lunar calendar. People can get pretty pharisaical about wanting it to be at precisely the right moment. And so he took that as an opportunity to make the Passover unchristian, and he started excommunicating any Christian that celebrated the Passover. He was effective at driving it underground, but we can tell because of how often he had to excommunicate Passover celebrators that there was quite a lot of people that continued to celebrate the Passover even after he made it an apostate declaration.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you again. Have any questions or comments before we end? Just to go over in the comments, I mean, a few people are asking. So at the conference, the meal will be given during the talks. And then Sunday is when the tables will be set up and the kind of walk through Passover and the symbolism will be done.
Yeah.
So, and then also I just want to thank everyone again for coming on every Friday night for the last 6 months. This has been going on for quite a while in preparation for this conference. There's been a lot of things that have been talked about, a lot of things that have been shared. So hopefully there's a lot of information that is there, the information that was shared tonight that can help us prepare for what can be given to us at the conference. We know as a people, we don't have many opportunities to get on things like this and to share and to talk. And so I think in the future, the hope is, or the plan is, to try to have something like this, either Friday nights or Saturday night, whatever we decide, but to somehow keep continuing to do something like this where we can talk and learn and discuss things.